Hi, my name is Sarah Farrell, and I'm an associate clinical social worker with Seattle Christian Counseling. I am here today to kind of give a brief introduction to my newest article, which is dealing with common myths of eating disorders. Eating disorders are highly misunderstood, and there are a lot of myths regarding what they look like, who gets them, what they will resemble, what treatment outcomes are like. Lots of different, highly variable understandings of eating disorders. This is very complicated. It brings a lot of complications to the table when such common mental illnesses are misunderstood, because we're dealing with things like anorexia and bulimia and other eating disorders that have high risk. They're extremely risky to have. Treatment can be complicated. And they're extremely common. An estimated 30 million people in the United States are estimated to have an eating disorder of some variety. That's a high number. That's a lot of people. So having myths that convolute treatment is really pretty dangerous when you consider what that might mean for people who are seeking treatment and for people who are encouraging loved ones to seek treatment or not. Because if eating disorders are seen as sort of a first world problem, why get treatment? Why not just start eating? Just put that cheeseburger in your mouth. What's the problem, right? So it's interesting to kind of look at what do those myths mean? What do they mean for people who are actually going to seek treatment? Eating disorders do have a high level of risk, as I mentioned. They are one of the most dangerous mental illnesses you can have, which that's really not well discussed in popular culture. We kind of view eating disorders very specifically. But eating disorders are risky. They have a high level of comorbid disorders. And this means that there are a lot of times there's depression and anxiety also prevalent in the population that has eating disorders. What this means exactly, we don't really know. However, it does indicate there's a likely genetic component, and it indicates that there are likely other factors in developing an eating disorder. Treatment of eating disorders can be very complex and long-term, and getting people into treatment can be complex and difficult. So when looking at the myths of eating disorders, it's important first to recognize who gets eating disorders. We think of eating disorders, and they are popularized in media, as being a disease of the young. People who just don't feel good about themselves, you'll probably outgrow it. Everybody diets sometimes, those sorts of ideas. It's seen as a disease of the young. It's seen as a disease of the beautiful, people who have the privilege to care, right, what they look like. It's also seen as a disease of specific ethnic groups. However, it's just not the case. It's seen as a disease of the socioeconomically privileged. And it's kind of seen as basically just a first world problem, right? Why not just eat? Well, that just snap out of it mentality is causing a lot of people to not seek treatment of arguably the most deadly mental illness that exists. Treatment is necessary and it is required, and to look at some of these myths indicates that likely a lot of people who have these eating disorders are not likely to get treatment because these are seen as a first world problem, right? So some of the myths we'll be covering in this article are the first, that eating disorders are visible externally. So you'll be able to tell if someone has an eating disorder, right? You picture a gaunt, thin ballerina or a gymnast or someone who's walking down the road and, look how good she looks in those skinny jeans, she must have an eating disorder. Those types of statements and that type of understanding is just flawed. It's not true. Eating disorders are not highly likely to be externally visible. Of course, there are exceptions to every rule. They may be, but there are a lot of reasons that someone could be very thin. And the misunderstanding with this is that people will be thin if they have an eating disorder. But statistically, people are highly likely to be of an average weight with a lot of the common eating disorders. The next myth about eating disorders is that they're all about weight. It's just not true. There are so many components and so many factors to look at when we look at the etiology, which is what happens, why we get something, what are the causes. And there's so many factors involved in the etiology of eating disorders that they aren't fully about weight. There are a lot of different things coming into play. Some of these can involve exposure to social media and advertising, exposure to different parental factors, and also things like personality type. There's a lot of different variations with eating disorders and what causes them. And honestly, we don't fully know. We do know it's not all about weight. The next myth. So myth number 3, only women have eating disorders. This is highly false and a highly dangerous myth because we have a lot of men who have disordered eating patterns, disordered eating habits that may be clinically significant, and these men are not likely to get treatment, especially our adolescent men who do believe this is a first world problem and it's a problem that only women have. Not true, and rates of eating disorders in men are rising rapidly. And if we want our men to get treatment for these sorts of things, or we want our sons, husbands to get treatment, we've got to look at what is the stigma surrounding that and how are our myths impacting one's ability to seek treatment and one's willingness. The 4th myth we're going to cover, people with eating disorders should just choose to eat, right? It's that just snap out of it mentality again. We do this with a lot of mental illnesses. Eating disorders are not the only one. However, it does impact. It impacts people's willingness to seek treatment, and these are dangerous disorders. Treatment is necessary. So when we look at eating disorders, we understand there's a genetic component. We understand there's a biological component. We understand there are social components. It's not as simple as just eat. And the underlying psychology of this is complex and not fully understood. We do know it is not that simple. Let's see. So our myth number 5, only young people have eating disorders. And it's true. Young people that's the most common time for them to come about. That's the most common time for long-term eating disorders to begin. However, it is not an issue of just young people in their teens and 20s, right? This is a long-term disease that can impact people over the age of 50. It's not very discerning, honestly. People of any socioeconomic status, people of any racial or ethnic group can all get eating disorders. They are more common in some groups. However, that does not mean they're the only ones who get them, nor does it mean that it's not significant in other groups and it doesn't need to be dealt with. And then finally, bulimia and anorexia are the only eating disorders. We've heard more recently, you've probably seen ads on the news about binge eating disorder. This is actually our most common eating disorder currently, and it's one that requires also treatment. It's not as simple as just, stop eating. So that's another thing we need to look at, is like what types of eating disorders are there and what types of habits are normal. When we look at the idea that everybody diets, that's not true, nor does it need to be true, and it's a prevalent social idea that is impacting people's ability to seek treatment for eating disorders. If you or someone you love, if you're concerned you have an eating disorder, if you're concerned your son or daughter does, or a friend, talk to them. Help them understand that this is not a first world problem, that you understand it's more complex than that. And if you'd like to seek treatment, you can reach out to us at Seattle Christian Counseling, and we are more than happy to get started in helping you work through your eating disorder alongside your doctor. I hope you have a good day, and I hope this was at least pretty interesting.